After years of marriage, my husband suddenly insisted we get a DNA test for our daughter. Confused, I agreed. When the results arrived, he opened them with a smirk, then his face went pale. This can't be right, he whispered. My heart pounded. I snatched the paper and read it. My hands shook. I whispered, then explain this. What we discovered changed everything. I never thought I'd be the one writing a story like this. I always read posts on this sub, shaking my head at the insanity of other people's lives, feeling sorry for them, but also grateful that my own marriage was solid. That my life was normal. That my husband, Mark, and I had built something real. Stable. Unshakable. But now I'm here, staring at a DNA test result that has shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. About my daughter. About my marriage. And the worst part? Mark is just standing there, pale as a ghost, his hands shaking, his lips barely moving as he whispers, This can't be right. Let me back up. Mark and I have been together for 14 years, married for 10. We met in college, did the whole whirlwind romance thing, got married in a small ceremony, and built a life together. We have a daughter, Lily. She's 9 years old, and was, the center of our world. She has Mark's smile. His love for animals. My nose. My temper. Our life was good. Normal. Until a few months ago. It started with Mark acting weird. At first, it was small things. He started getting distant, coming home later than usual, spending more time on his phone. I thought it was work stress. His company was going through a restructure, and people were getting laid off left and right. I figured he was worried about job security. But then it got worse. He stopped touching me. He would roll away from me in bed, flinch when I reached for his hand. He barely looked at Lily. And the way he looked at me? It was like he was searching for something. Like he was trying to catch me in a lie I hadn't told. I confronted him one night after Lily went to bed. What's going on with you? I asked. He sighed, rubbing his face. Nothing. Work is stressful. Bullshit, I snapped. You're avoiding me. You're avoiding Lily. His jaw clenched. He hesitated. And then, out of nowhere, he said it. We should get a DNA test for Lily. I laughed. I actually laughed because it was so absurd. Are you serious? His face didn't change. I need to know. The room went completely silent. Something inside me cracked. You need to know what, Mark? He didn't answer. My stomach dropped. I felt like I was falling, like the floor had been ripped out from under me. He thought I cheated on him. I should have been angry. Maybe I was, in some deep part of me, but mostly, I felt sick. Because why was he so sure? Why had he been pulling away from me? Why did he look so certain that I had done something I knew I hadn't? I tried to argue, to ask him why he suddenly needed this. He just kept saying, I need to know. That night, I barely slept. Mark stayed in the guest room. I kept replaying every moment of our life together, every second of my pregnancy, every detail of Lily's birth. Had something happened that I didn't remember? Had there been some mix-up? A mistake? It was impossible. But something in Mark's voice, something about the certainty in it, made me agree. So we took the test. And today, the results came. Mark tore the envelope open in front of me, his hands steady. His eyes smug. I think he was waiting for this moment. For the confirmation that he had been right all along. But the second he saw the results, his whole body went rigid. His face drained of color. His hands shook. This can't be right. I grabbed the paper. My vision blurred as I scanned the results. And then, I saw it. Mark was not Lily's biological father. The world stopped. I don't even know how long I sat there, staring at the paper, my brain refusing to make sense of what I was reading. I never cheated. Not once. Not ever. But there it was. Scientific proof that my husband wasn't our daughter's father. My hands shook. I couldn't breathe. I looked at Mark, waiting for him to accuse me, to start screaming, but he just stood there, looking like he was about to collapse. Explain this, I whispered. Mark just shook his head, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to say something but couldn't. His whole body was trembling. And then it hit me. He wasn't shocked that the test was wrong. He was shocked because it was right. I swallowed, my throat dry as sandpaper. You've known, haven't you? His head snapped up. What? I felt like I was going to throw up. You've been acting weird for weeks, Mark. You already knew, didn't you? He hesitated. And that's when I saw it. The guilt. Mark let out a long, shaky breath. He sat down on the couch, his head in his hands. I did a test weeks ago. My entire body turned to ice. You what? I took a sample from Lily. Sent it in. His voice was hollow. The results came back. It said I wasn't her father. And you didn't tell me? I screamed. I didn't know how. His voice cracked. I thought it was a mistake. That maybe the test was wrong. So I made you take another one. I felt like I was going to pass out. And now that this test says the same thing. Mark didn't answer. He just stared at me, like I was some stranger. I stood there, shaking, furious. I never cheated. So how the hell was this possible? The next few days were hell. Mark barely spoke to me. He wouldn't even look at me. I kept trying to rack my brain, trying to think of anything, that could explain this. But there was nothing. No one-night stand. No drunken mistake. Nothing. And then I remembered something. I still had Lily's hospital records. I tore through every drawer, every filing cabinet, searching for them. My hands shook as I pulled out the file, flipping through the pages. And then, I saw it. Buried in the paperwork, something so small, so easy to miss, but once I saw it, my entire world collapsed. Lily's hospital ID bracelet had a different last name. It wasn't ours. It wasn't anyone I recognized. My vision blurred. I read it again. And again. A mix-up. A fucking mix-up. I felt my legs buckle. If Mark wasn't Lily's father. Then who was? My fingers tightened around the hospital records. My mind refused to process what I was looking at. A different last name. Not ours. Not Lily's. A mistake. Oh my God. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I felt my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The room tilted. Mark saw my face and snatched the paper from my hands. His eyes scanned it. His breath hitched. For the first time in days, we were on the same page. Something was terribly wrong. Mark bolted to his feet, pacing like a caged animal. This can't be real. This can't happen. His voice cracked, and for a second, I saw something I never thought I'd see. Tears. Mark never cried. Not at our wedding, not when Lily was born. But now? He looked shattered. His hands balled into fists. His body shook. So where the hell is my daughter? He whispered. I had no answer. And that terrified me. I don't remember driving to the hospital. I barely remember parking. My body was moving on autopilot, my hands cold and numb. Mark and I stormed into the lobby, demanding to speak to someone. A nurse led us to an office, where a tired-looking woman in a stiff blazer sat behind a desk. We shoved the papers in front of her. Explain this. The woman's face went pale as she read. She licked her lips, her fingers twitching as she flipped through the documents. She hesitated. I slammed my hand on the desk. Tell us. She jumped. Looked at us like we were ticking time bombs. Then, slowly, she let out a long, shaky breath. There was an incident. A report. What report? Mark growled. Her hands trembled as she pulled out a thick file from a drawer. A mistake was flagged years ago. But, she swallowed, avoiding our eyes. It was never followed up. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Never. Followed. Up. Mark exploded. You're telling me you knew my daughter was taken from me and you just forgot? The woman flinched. We didn't forget, sir. The nurse who flagged it. She hesitated, looking away. She passed away shortly after. The report got lost in the system. It was an oversight. Mark slammed his fist on the desk. An oversight? I couldn't breathe. My head was spinning. I could barely hear them over the roaring in my ears. Where is our daughter? I gripped the edge of the desk, forcing myself to speak. Where is she? Where is my real daughter? The woman's hands clenched into fists. We'll have to track her down. Track her down. Like she was some lost package instead of my child. The ground felt like it was crumbling beneath me. Somewhere out there, my daughter was living with another family. A family who thought she was theirs. A family who had no idea. Mark turned to me, his voice dead serious. We're finding her. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Because one thing was clear, this wasn't over. A week later, we had a name. The hospital traced the mistake back to a woman named Rachel Carter. The moment I heard it, my stomach twisted. Rachel Carter. I didn't know her. I'd never heard of her before. But she had my daughter. We found her number. Mark wanted to call, but I needed to see her face when we told her. So we drove. Her house was in a quiet suburb, too normal for something this twisted. I had no idea what I was expecting. A mansion? A rundown shack? But it was just a house. A regular house. My hands trembled as I rang the doorbell. A woman opened the door. Mid-30s. Shoulder-length brown hair. My daughter's eyes. The moment we locked eyes, I knew. She knew something was wrong, too. I could see it in her face. The same fear I felt. "Can I help you?" she asked hesitantly. I swallowed hard. My voice barely worked. "We need to talk about our daughters." Her face went white. And that's when the screaming started. Rachel didn't take it well. She refused to believe it. "This is a mistake," she cried. "This has to be some scam." Mark handed her the hospital records. The proof. Her hands shook as she read. Her face crumbled. I could see it happening. The exact same earth-shattering moment I had when I saw those DNA results. Her legs buckled. She collapsed onto the couch, gasping for air. I felt nothing. I was too numb. She looked up at me, her voice breaking. If my daughter isn't mine." She swallowed. "Then where is she?" Silence. I saw her mind racing. The same nightmare thoughts I had. The same terror. And then, her eyes flickered. Something changed. She glanced over her shoulder, toward the hallway. Toward a room with the door slightly ajar. I saw a glimpse of a little girl. Dark curls. Wide, curious eyes. My eyes. Rachel's face hardened. She stood up. And then she said something that made my blood turn to ice. "You can't have her." Mark and I froze. "What did you just say?" Mark whispered. Rachel squared her shoulders. "I've raised her for 9 years. She's my daughter." I stared at her, heart pounding. "She's mine." She shook her head, gripping the edge of the couch. "She's mine." I felt my world tilt. She wasn't just in shock. She meant it. Rachel knew the truth. And she didn't care. She wasn't going to give her up. And suddenly, I realized something far, far worse. Rachel had known all along. Rachel's words echoed in my skull. "You can't have her." Mark and I just stood there, frozen. It didn't make sense. No mother, no decent person, would say that after learning the truth. Unless she already knew. I swallowed hard, my hands clenching into fists. "Rachel, what do you mean?" She lifted her chin, her eyes darkening. "I mean, I'm not giving her up." Mark took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "That's not your choice to make." Rachel's face twisted. "You don't understand," she snapped. "She's my daughter. She calls me mom. I've raised her since birth. You can't just come here and rip her away, she's not yours." I screamed, my voice raw. Rachel flinched, like the words physically hit her. Her shoulders heaved as she gasped for air. And then, her entire body went still. She closed her eyes, taking a long, shaky breath. And when she opened them, I knew. She knew. She had always known. Mark saw it too. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "How long have you known, Rachel?" She didn't answer. I took a shaky step forward, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me the truth. Did you know all along?" Rachel swallowed. Looked away. Her jaw clenched. And then, in the quietest voice, she said it. Yes. She knew. My stomach dropped. Rachel knew she was raising my daughter. My voice came out hoarse. "Since when?" She didn't answer. I reached for the couch to steady myself. "Rachel. Since when?" Her breath hitched. Her eyes flickered to the girl standing in the hallway, watching us. And then, since she was a baby. The world tipped. My knees gave out, and I collapsed onto the couch, my breath coming in short, gasping sobs. Rachel knew. She had known for years. She had kept my daughter. I felt Mark's hand on my shoulder. He was shaking. His entire body trembling with rage. You stole our daughter, he whispered. Rachel's face hardened. I didn't steal her. I just. She faltered. I couldn't give her up. She's not yours. Mark shouted, his voice breaking. Rachel's whole body tensed. And then, the worst part, she started crying. Not fake tears. Not some crocodile act. Real. Gut-wrenching. Sobbing. She buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook violently. You don't understand, she choked out. You don't, she staggered back, gripping the wall for support. And then, she said something that made my blood run cold. You think I was the only one who knew? Mark and I both froze. Rachel looked up at us, eyes red and swollen. Her breath came out in a shudder. And then she whispered, ask the hospital. A thick, suffocating silence filled the room. Mark's whole body went rigid. What did you say? Rachel let out a hollow, broken laugh. You really think it was a simple mistake? I could barely breathe. The hospital. The place where our daughter was born. What did they do? Rachel wiped her face with trembling fingers. I was supposed to take home my daughter. But they came to me. They said there was a mistake. She looked away. They told me my baby, my real baby, didn't make it. I stilled. The air left my lungs. What? Rachel's voice broke. They told me she died. A birth complication. Said she was gone before they could even bring her to me. I felt sick. Then a nurse, she came to me, crying. She told me there was another baby. A mother who wasn't ready. Who was in a coma. Her voice dropped. She told me I could take her home. That no one would know. My stomach turned inside out. Oh my God. Mark's breathing was ragged, sharp. They gave you our daughter. Rachel's whole body trembled. I didn't know. Not at first. She shook her head violently. I didn't want to believe it. But when I saw the birth records later, I knew. I knew the truth. My hands curled into fists. You let me believe my daughter was dead. My voice was barely above a whisper. Rachel looked up, tears spilling down her cheeks. I couldn't lose her. Not after losing my baby. I was going to be sick. Mark turned away, his whole body shaking. Rachel sobbed, gripping the edge of the couch. I love her. I love her like she's mine. I don't know what I'll do if you take her away from me. I felt a scream building in my throat. I didn't care. I wanted my daughter back. But then I realized, if Rachel's baby had really died, where was the other child from the switch? The room felt too small. My mind was spinning. I turned to Rachel, my voice hoarse. If they gave you my daughter, what happened to yours? Rachel stilled. Her expression changed. She looked confused. I don't know. A horrible, awful feeling settled in my gut. Rachel stared down at the floor, her voice distant. I always wondered why they rushed me out of the hospital. Why they didn't let me see a body. I grabbed Mark's arm. We need to go. Rachel's head snapped up. Wait. What are you? I didn't wait. I ran to the car, my pulse thundering in my ears. Mark was right behind me. Where are we going? He asked, his voice frantic. I swallowed, gripping the wheel. Back to the hospital. Because now, I had a new question. If Rachel was given my daughter, who was given hers? I drove like a madwoman. Mark's hand was gripping the dashboard so tight his knuckles were white, but he didn't tell me to slow down. We were both thinking the same thing. If Rachel had been given our daughter, then someone else had been given hers. Someone was out there, raising a child that wasn't theirs. Someone had lost a baby that never actually died. Back to the beginning, we burst into the hospital's administration office, demanding answers. The same woman who had given us the original paperwork sat stiffly behind her desk, her face too calm. Like she'd been expecting this. We need to see the records, Mark snapped. Her jaw tightened. I told you, this was a mistake. I cut her off. My hand slammed down on the desk. I don't believe that anymore. She blinked. I leaned in. My voice was low, dangerous. What really happened here? A flicker of something passed over her face. Guilt. She knew. I fucking knew it. Mark's voice was lethal. If you don't tell us, I swear to God, I will ruin this hospital. I will take this to every news station, every lawyer, every courtroom. Do you understand me? Her face paled. She hesitated. And then, she picked up the phone. 15 minutes later, a man in a dark suit walked in. His ID badge said Dr. Alan Reynolds, hospital administrator. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't shake our hands. He just sat down, folded his hands, and sighed. I was afraid this day would come. My stomach curled. What are you talking about? Dr. Reynolds exhaled slowly. What happened to your daughters wasn't a simple mix-up. My pulse pounded. Mark clenched his fists. Then what was it? Reynolds hesitated. And then, in the most calm, matter-of-fact voice, he said, it was intentional. I couldn't breathe. I gripped the chair, my whole body trembling. What? Reynolds pinched the bridge of his nose. The switch was covered up. Because Rachel's baby, he hesitated. Her baby was alive when she gave birth. But he was critically ill. A son. Rachel had given birth to a boy. A weak, sickly baby who wasn't expected to survive the week. My hands curled into fists. So why? My voice cracked. Why did they switch them? Reynolds looked at us. His eyes were cold, detached. Because the doctor in charge knew that Rachel's husband was an abusive man. Wait. What? Mark and I both stared. Reynolds continued. Rachel's husband, David Carter, had a history of domestic violence. CPS had investigated them before. The hospital staff knew if she went home with a sick baby, he would blame her. He might hurt her. Maybe worse. My stomach twisted violently. So they gave her our daughter instead? Mark's voice was hoarse. Reynolds nodded. They made the choice to switch the babies. They let her believe her son had died so she wouldn't suffer at home. I felt sick. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a decision. A decision that had ruined our lives. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. And the boy? Rachel's real son? Where did he go? Reynolds hesitated too long. Mark shot up from his chair. Where is he? Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. He was placed in foster care. I gasped. What? He wasn't expected to survive. The doctors assumed it would be easier that way. Easier. They let Rachel's real son disappear into the system. While she raised mine. Rachel showed up at the hospital 20 minutes later. I had called her. She looked haunted. Her eyes were hollow, her whole body shaking. Tell me it's not true, she whispered. Reynolds didn't even flinch. It's true. Rachel collapsed into a chair, her hands over her mouth. A son. She had a son. And she had spent 9 years raising a child that wasn't hers, while her real son was out there, somewhere. I watched as it broke her. And then, her eyes snapped to me. And suddenly, the grief turned into anger. You called me a thief, she hissed. I swallowed hard. You thought I took her, she whispered, her voice full of pain. You thought I was a monster. But it was them. They did this. I didn't know what to say. She stood up so fast the chair tipped over. I want my son. I nodded. And I want my daughter. Mark's jaw tightened. He turned to Reynolds. We're going to find him. And we're taking legal action. Reynolds exhaled. I expected that. Rachel's eyes burned with rage. I want the names of everyone involved. I want them to rot in jail. Reynolds hesitated. Some of them are already dead. Rachel laughed bitterly. Good. And just like that, the war had begun. The next 6 months were a nightmare. Rachel and I worked together, but only because we had no choice. We hired lawyers. We dug through old files. We searched for her son. And we found him. His name was Ethan. He had been passed through 4 different foster homes. He was alive, but barely holding on. Rachel met him first. I watched as she collapsed into his arms, sobbing. I stood in the doorway, watching her hold her real son for the first time. And behind me, Mark was holding our daughter. She clung to him like she had always known. In the end, we both got what we wanted. Rachel got her son back. I got my daughter. But nothing felt okay. Rachel and I never became friends. We were too broken for that. We would always see each other's child in the wrong arms. Mark and I went to therapy. We tried to fix the cracks. Some of them healed. Some of them didn't. I don't know if we'll make it. But at least now, we know the truth. And the truth ruined us all.